Hey everyone, and welcome if you're here for the replay or if you're able to make it live. Welcome. I first am going to introduce myself in case you're new here. My name is Shannon Crow. I use she, her pronouns. I am not an expert in vaccines, in science, or people medicine. I did study animal medicine in college. I live with a health and science journalist who probably gets tired of my many questions. And I feel like I have more questions than answers. And when I ask him questions about science, I feel like I generate more questions, and that can feel uncomfortable. I also want to share that this call is close to my heart. This year, my family dealt with the death of my cousin who died of COVID before the vaccine was available. And seeing my family impacted by this definitely informs my views. And I have loved ones and friends and family who have chosen to get fully vaccinated, some who are vaccine hesitant, some who have chosen not to get the vaccine at all. And I respect those choices. I want to say that right away. My immediate family, we live here in Canada and we're fully vaccinated, and so is 83% of our population here. So I also want to say, like, just where I am in the world, we have a really high rate of vaccines and we're able to get vaccines, and that's not the case all over the world. And the goal of today's live interview, thank you for being here, everyone, is to talk with Drew Hume. Welcome, Drew. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Shannon.
We're going to break down some of this misinformation, talk about scope of practice, and the goal is to really come back to, like, how can this be yoga? So if you have ideas on that, let us know in the comments, say hi in the comments. And I also want to acknowledge that we're all making tough choices right now, and there's policies coming in place all around the world. And so if you're feeling like, oh gosh, this is really triggering me, or I'm feeling like this is dividing us, can you press pause, go for a walk? But I know I have like a lot of faith in our connected yoga teachers that we can have this conversation with a lot of compassion for each other. And so also the yoga is like, notice the discomfort that comes up. I feel kind of nervous about having an uncomfortable conversation. And so we're here together doing that. And you can ask your questions in the comments. Drew and I are going to chat away, and we might not get to them for a little bit, but we'll check in with the comments. And so Drew is a friend of mine, a yoga teacher, a scientist. Drew, thank you so much for being here. Tell us about yourself. I would love for you to do your own introduction.
Awesome. Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, my background is in human biology. I have a degree of applied science in human biology. And so as we get into some of the topics today that we'll talk about, I should also preview that I'm not specifically an expert in virology, public health, and in vaccines specifically. And in saying that, I have also studied all of those topics to a degree in university, in my degree. And so there will be some pulling upon all of those topics from that university structure. And on top of that, I am also a yoga instructor, and I teach certain courses to yoga instructors, specifically in anatomy and physiology, and also in manual therapy. And yeah, that's sort of my background. And Shannon and I, we connected just the other day about a post that has come up from Gil Headley. And I think it's also important to say that beyond a single post, this conversation also is about a broader conversation that's occurring in especially the yoga community at the moment around vaccination and related topics. And this most recent post is more of a catalyst to having this difficult conversation. So yeah, so just sort of prefacing with that. And also noting I'm coming to you from Costa Rica, which is obviously not my homeland, and we are on Indigenous Barukan land. And that down here, the accessibility to medical care, whilst good for a Central American country, is also not the same as the Canadian landscape. And vaccine availability is increasing and not quite in the same position as Costa Rica has been waiting or has been benefiting from a lot of donations from more wealthier countries that have the capacity to make such donations. So part of what we'll be talking about is nuance as it relates to these various topics that are intertwined. And I think within that nuance, it's important to set context of where we are, and then also then how that might influence certain decisions that we make.
Thank you so much for saying the nuances there, and for also saying this is a much larger conversation. I've had yoga teachers reach out to me and say that they're overwhelmed by seeing comments that feel really harmful. And when the harm is called out, I think it's very important that we come to a place where we can hear the community that is saying, I'm being harmed by these comments. And one of the things that came up in this post was a comparison of the vaccine to the Holocaust, to intersex surgery and circumcision. And so I wonder if you can talk about, like, why is that harmful? And I also want to acknowledge that people are coming from a place where they are feeling like, I want to make the choices with my body. And I see, these are also things where people feel like that choice has been taken away, or freedoms have been taken away, or control is put on a group of people. So why do you think, or do you think, Drew, that these are harmful?
Right. Yes. Okay. Before I get into that, I think what I should also say is the intent of all of the things that we are about to talk about, that I will personally say, I would like to also preface with that Gil Hedley is a very well-respected anatomist and has been critical in especially the most recent 2 decades around the science of connective tissues and how our understanding of the human body and the human organism has evolved over those last couple of decades. And I don't think that his works to date necessarily are a part of this conversation. I think this conversation is more about the responsibility of someone with so much influence and so many people connected to them to present on their personal page and on their business page, also with full knowing that personal and business pages are seen by our clients and our potential clients, right? The people that buy our stuff. Is also to note that we have a substantial responsibility, and so responsibility feeds into what you mentioned, Shannon, about harm done, the ability to listen, the ability to make reparations and share apologies for that. And also responsibility comes from the perspective of, like, am I being truthful? Am I in the yoga community, are we talking about satya here? Are we being truthful in the words that we're sharing? And how are we recognizing the words that we're sharing and the impact that they're having on the people that are reading them? And so we're going to do a little bit of a dissection on the post and also tie in additional examples from outside of the post, both highlighting where there's false information and also highlighting perhaps where there are some errors made. And so, Shannon, the pieces that you mentioned there, especially about the comparisons. So let's dig into that, shall we? The comparisons of the Holocaust. I will jump in there first because that's a deep pool to swim in. So we'll tackle that bit first. And I think how I'd like to frame this up is by recognizing that everyone, to some degree, regardless of where you sit on the spectrum of pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine, or somewhere in the middle, I think to a degree, there's a certain amount of fear for everyone regarding something, whether it's fear around infection from the virus or fear around all of the other things that have been said about the vaccine, right? Both sides embody a substantial amount of fear. And I think the post was intended to communicate that degree of fear in certain ways. And we'll talk about that, I think, more at the end. But the execution and the establishment of context was done really poorly, because the Holocaust absolutely has nothing to do at all with being recommended a vaccine. And this is where, a number of comments on the post did share how harmful that comparison is, and reparations and apologies were not offered for that. And I think, again, when we have such influence, and even when we don't have such influence, I think as it relates to compassion and ahimsa and doing no harm, we have to be willing to listen and hear and then apologize for those types of comments. And that was one of the things that was missing from the dialogue, was an acceptance that context was established poorly, and examples, false equivalence was made where there isn't equivalence. And it is quite harmful to suggest that a vaccine has any similarities to the Holocaust, considering the number of people that were murdered in the Holocaust, number one, and the circumstances through which they suffered. Whereas now we're talking about a voluntary vaccine that you can either choose to participate in or not. And the Holocaust was absolutely completely different to that. And so I think I understand where the example was coming from. The idea was fear-based, and it was used very poorly. And it was the wrong example to use, period. So yeah, I think in the essence of being truthful, and also in the essence of doing no harm or embodying compassion, there needed to be some element of remorse expressed around that comparison, not just a clarification, because I did read a comment of Gil's where there was an attempted clarification of what was intended. And that's where we need to get into the conversation of where intent and impact are two very different things. Especially if we look at it from a context of not having ever experienced the Holocaust personally, and then using it as an example for our own message to be thrown out into the world on. And there was no recognition of that. The clarification was that it was allegory and not intended to be harmful. And that's unfortunately not what we're repairing that has been done. So that's sort of the first piece there around the comparison with the Holocaust and where we're at now. And the second comparison that...
Drew, before you go on there, I just want to share
do you want to jump in there, Shannon?
Yeah. I don't know if my internet acts up. It'll be yours or mine, because we both have funky internet sometimes. One person was just saying, thank you so much for speaking to the Holocaust reference. This has been so harmful for me as a Jew, and I've seen this same phrasing for so many in the wellness community. So this is where we listen to the people of the Jewish community when they say, this is harmful to me as someone in this community. And that was done over and over again in that post. And I think you're right. It really does need to be listened to, even if the intent isn't there. And yeah, so thank you, whoever this is saying that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think when we establish context of a discussion, and when we use allegory or we use examples to demonstrate an idea, the best thing that we can do with any example is get as close to the topic as possible. And so examples that would have fit better would have been something related to another pandemic, something related to the application of another type of vaccine, or an example that utilized contagion as its basis, right? Utilizing an example that is entirely unrelated to those things definitely builds fear, but doesn't do justice the topic at hand, nor does it actually help the conversation around anti-Semitism, for example. It certainly does harm there.
Yeah, thank you. And so then the other two comparisons were when things were done like intersex surgery while someone is an infant, or circumcision. So coming back to that, we want to be making choices with our body. I don't know if you want to speak to that one as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think I should also lead by saying that the idea of informed consent is a wonderful idea. And before we get into those examples, I think that it's important to highlight that we all absolutely, with this vaccine or the options of vaccines that we have, we all have the ability to give informed consent or abstain. That choice most definitely still exists for everybody. Another comment that was on the post shared that truthfully, that not a single person who has received the vaccine has been deceived into taking the vaccine, has been coerced into taking the vaccine, or has done so involuntarily. In fact, the opposite has actually happened, where people who believed they were getting the vaccine, there was a German nurse who decided she would take it upon herself to choose 4 people, and she gave them saline injections instead. And I think that was the sum of maybe 9,000 people who believed they were getting the vaccine and were not given it because someone on the other side of the equation actually decided that they would take away the choice of other people. And so I think that the only thing that's happened there is actually on the other side, people have been coerced or forcibly removed from a situation where they were consenting to the vaccine.
I also want to note here, and this was really new and I didn't get a link for it, but I think it was Doug Keller who was involved in that thread yesterday, said that also people are being held back. So there are protests happening at different vaccination places and people are not able to access a vaccine when they want to receive it. So I think I had no idea that many people didn't get the vaccine. And so thank you for bringing that forward.
Yeah, I think it also helps to establish context. Again, I understand the fear of the idea of being coerced into something or not having the choice. And though the reality of the situation is we all do have the choice to either take the vaccine or not, or take a vaccine or not.
Something
And
that was
so,
also said in that thread, sorry, Drew, was that because different policies are coming in, and I know this is new in Ontario as of today, the announcement was just made, that because of vaccine passports here in Canada, that was people were saying, well, I won't be able to go to the places I want to go to or keep my job or do all of these things. So is that a form of coercion?
I think this is when nuance really plays a heavy role, because you still have a choice. You absolutely still have a choice. You're being encouraged in a particular direction. And though what you don't like is not that you're being encouraged in a particular direction, it's that you don't like the outcome, or you don't like the consequence of the decision that you are accepting necessarily, right? And so it's a mismatch of understanding, I think, between what is coercion and what is consequence of our decisions. We have to deal with and manage the consequence of many other decisions that we make in our lives. And whilst I understand that they're not necessarily wonderful consequences of a decision to not get vaccinated, you are going into your decision understanding what the consequences are. They're not hidden consequences. Nothing about that is hidden. And so coercion is not the right word. The right way to explain it, I think, is to dislike the consequences of choosing whoever it is not to accept a vaccine, right? And not liking the consequences is very different. And in some instances, understandable because you don't get to do the things that you want to do. I would also highlight that if that's, that being a major concern for us is indeed quite a privilege to have if we're just concerned about the things that we want to do. So I'll sort of pop that in there. And so coming back to this comparison of circumcision and surgery on intersex people and how it was employed to demonstrate an urgency of the current state of affairs was really, I think, also not very well done. Besides the fact that circumcision is absolutely not in any way, shape, or form comparable to surgery on genitalia in intersex people, besides the fact that that's not in any way comparable, the two of those things were positioned as being close to the border of immorality, but not beyond it. And then that being marketed and being suggested to have a vaccine was speeding down a slope that ends in the loss of all of our liberties and choices. And I think that that is substantially insensitive, to first of all suggest that a choice of a vaccine or being marketed some materials is in any way, shape, or form close to or approximating surgery, and then in any way, shape, or form worse than non-consensual surgery for intersex people. I think that demonstrates, again, no personal experience of that situation, yet employing that situation as another platform upon which to send out a message. And so when I read that, I thought, oh, that is the statement that is being made is not really what I think he wanted to say, but the statement being made is that non-consensual surgery on certain people, being intersex people, is actually, I'm kind of okay with it. It's at the borderline of my moral compass. And so, we need to address it, but it's not urgent. And yet being encouraged to take a vaccine is well beyond. We're sliding down a slippery slope, and that slope ends in the loss of all of our liberties. And so I think that that's a harmful comparison and a harmful position to place non-consensual surgeries for intersex peoples on that experience. And tying it back to this idea of satya or truthfulness, it's all speculation. None of it, none of the idea of the loss of all of our liberties is based in any evidence. Not any evidence from the current pandemic, nor any evidence from previous pandemics throughout history. We've always, come out of collectively a pandemic returning to somewhat of a normal experience after each one. And there's no evidence to suggest that this one will be any different whenever we do start to come out the other side of it. And so the projection of fear in this particular example comes out as a relatively illogical but fearful outcome of losing our liberties, of losing our freedoms, of losing our ability to move around. Again, the fear is understandable, but the context and the reality of it doesn't represent that at all.
Yeah, I found this to really bring up a lot for me because I am a parent and had to make choices with my boys around circumcision. That was a long time ago, and there's a lot of emotion behind these topics. So for me, it felt like, wow, this is really poking some things in a hurry for me. And I was reading the same thing. My next question is around scope of practice. And I talk about this a lot on the podcast. I talk about it a lot in my own um, place of being a yoga teacher. So I'd like to dig into like, who are the experts right now that we should be listening to? And I am hearing different people say like experts are being silenced. You're not hearing the actual experts, or, there is this that fear that videos are being taken down. We're not hearing the correct information. So how do we find that?
Yeah, for sure. I think scope of practice, especially when we have, again, influence with other people, is really important. It's a really important boundary to set for ourselves, and therefore, excuse me, a boundary with which we protect the people that we're in contact with. When it comes to information on public health, we should be listening to public health officials. When it comes to information on vaccinations, we should be listening to virologists. When it comes to scientific information, we should be listening to the people who have expertise in those arenas. And something interesting that I found out, as it relates to this one particular example, is that Gil has, again, he's done wonderful things in the world of the human body, and yet has had no formal education in human biology. And so it's unlikely that he has received or taken part in a balanced process for education on various topics related to the body. Because this is related to the human body. And so one might assume that if you have expertise or if you've grown a huge following in a particular arena relative to the human body, then that might suggest that you know things that perhaps you've never really taken part in formal education in. And informal education is not to be discounted at all. It's just to note that informal education and self-directed learning is often not as balanced, because we typically go in an effort to confirm our own biases. And we also don't necessarily know the questions to ask when we are just doing it all by ourselves. So, seek expertise, and in the broad scheme of things, play statistics as well. If 97% of the scientists, of the virologists in the world, are saying one thing, it's relatively safe to put your eggs in that 97% basket, right? I think the 3%, perhaps it's not to discount them entirely, but to put it in the context of the collective understanding of the topic. And if 97% of the collective understanding of that particular topic says one thing, then it likely is that thing or very close to that thing. And then in the context of, the fear of other experts being silenced, my difficult question to pose for that is, if they have been really truly silenced, how is it that you're coming into contact with that information? Okay. Or is it, again, if we're being truthful with ourselves, if we're being deeply honest with ourselves, or is it that there's a lot of resistance against that particular perspective? Okay, because resistance against a particular perspective is one thing, and silencing is another. And if someone is truly silenced, then you wouldn't hear about whatever their perspective is. If their perspective is out there and available and you have a YouTube video linked to it, or they have a website or anything like that, they're not being silenced. So I think that's where we need to get, tough honesty with ourselves when it comes to that. Again, it's a fear. Recognize the fear that we have in that. And if we've come into contact with it, it's not that we are wonderful investigators. I'm sorry, it's not. It's that It's that the silencing hasn't actually taken place.
Right. Yeah, I've had friends reach out and say, "Well, I can only send you this in an email or like this WeTransfer file," like very and exactly the same thing if it's not up on YouTube and then different people can review it, if it's not peer reviewed, if it's yeah, to really be looking at. And then this gets into I have shared I like to share on my Instagram stories like funny memes or whatever, and then I will get something from an expert and I think, "Oh, this is really good. I want to share it." And I know this is happening. I don't want to say on both sides because there are many, many sides to this, but um do you have anyone that you really follow right now and you think, "Ah, this message is so helpful for yoga teachers to listen to," or
Mm,
where do you think where could we go and check some things out?
that's a wonderful, wonderful question. I wouldn't necessarily say there's one particular person. Um, in general, someone that I think encompasses and captures scientific nuance really well is the Huberman Lab. Um, and there's not necessarily, there may be a couple, but there's not necessarily a huge amount of resources available specifically related to vaccines and COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2. However, it's wonderful practice for us to be exposed to scientific method and scientific discussion, and he does it very well in the context of balanced perspective, building context around evidence so that we understand where this evidence relates to and where it doesn't necessarily touch. Um, and that exposure, I think, helps us to develop a little bit more of an internal process of scientific method.
Super helpful. It gives me a great sense of comfort to think like, okay, these 97% of people who have done all of this work, that's really their job. So I can focus on my job. And it's not my job to tell people to get vaccinated or not get vaccinated as a yoga teacher. And it's not within my scope of practice at all. I can share like a photo of me getting vaccinated if I choose to, or how I'm
Mm-hmm.
feeling about anything that's coming up. But in terms of telling our students, let's not tell our students because think of the dangerous consequences on either way. If you told someone the vaccine's right for you, but you have no idea of their medical history, or no, don't get vaccinated. Here's why. Here's the list of reasons why you shouldn't. That's a huge responsibility. It's not for us as yoga teachers, which is also liberating.
Yeah, I think so as well. I do think that recognizing where our endpoint is gives us freedom, absolutely, because it's not our position, like you said, to offer that advice to different individuals where we don't understand their medical history, um, or potential drug use before, or potential risk factors that may not necessarily be presenting in an everyday context that we may not know about. Um, and so, yeah, I think as yoga instructors, we do well to establish that boundary and hold firm to it.
Yeah. Someone else is saying something here, and I just want to say thank you. I don't have your name on here, but this brings up this question like the anti science voices in yoga land are loud. I agree. I'm hearing it's sometimes very upsetting. What do we do if we see this being shared or posted about? And I want to tell you that when I first saw this post, I just wanted to sit back and watch what was going to happen. And I really like appreciate that some people were brave to step in there first and say something when they said, "Wait a second, this seems there are some problems with this." So what do we do when we see this happening?
It's such a conflicting space to be in. I really do understand, especially if we have developed respect for whomever is making the post, right, or for whomever is sharing the information. I think that we've got all of the options available to us, whether it's to stop following them, to exit from the community, or to keep going. And on top of that, I also think that engaging in conversation and asking questions that perhaps dig at deeper elements of an idea can in some instances be helpful. Either for the person who posted it to really sort of dig deeper into what they think they understand and perhaps deconstruct some ideas that they've adopted that maybe aren't really their own ideas, or depending on the response, they might be questions that position us in a way that helps us to understand how we choose our community, how we choose the people that we share time and space with, and consume information from. I do think that the checking of credentials, whilst not everything, I do think the checking of credentials is important. I have seen countless times where the people who are maybe positioned as experts on the side of the equation where the message is against the vaccines, they're positioning themselves as doctors, and yet their doctorate is not in a related field, not related to human biology, not related to vaccines, not related to virology, microbiology, human biochemistry, nothing. More related to business or something, or ethics, or something entirely separate. And whilst the doctorate is wonderfully valuable and important, it's valuable for that topic in which they have expertise in. And so we have to position that perspective according to those credentials and that expertise. Something that you and I spoke about, Shannon, in an additional video or podcast at some point in time was that all evidence is not equally weighted, that all perspectives are not equal, and validity is not encapsulated in the presence of an opinion. A validity is based upon the weight of evidence, as opposed to simply being an idea that's present or presented. And that feeds into this whole credential conversation around, like, credentials, yes, are important and relative to their field, right? As opposed to giving carte blanche to speak to any range of different topics that we so desire. And in also some instances, the universities or the colleges from which these doctorates were garnered, some of them have actually been closed down due to being illegitimate universities and things like that, but the doctorate still holds. And there have been a number of instances of that over time, not just related to this pandemic, but over time.
This is a good reminder to look into people's credentials, and you can even ask people, are you an expert in virology? Are you a medical professional? Neil Pearson talks about scope of competence, and I like this question. Am I competent in this? Even if it's in our scope of practice, do I feel really competent in this as well? I want to dig into some of the dangerous misinformation, not just in this post, but also that I'm seeing, but I was able to kind of pull some things. So one comment that kept coming through, and I keep hearing this from multiple people, is that the vaccine is not approved. Do you want to talk about, and I mean FDA approved? I keep hearing this.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, the Pfizer vaccine is actually now FDA approved. And beyond that, emergency approval for the phase in which it was approved for the emergency of the pandemic is still approval. And I'd like to highlight that because it's important to recognize that before that emergency approval was garnered or won, substantial study had been undertaken with the vaccines and result be incredibly positive. And then those results informed the emergency approval. So there is now FDA approval for the Pfizer vaccine, and beyond that, emergency approval still is a form of approval based upon evidence, based upon quality, repeatable, evidence from the large-scale studies that were done. And some people will say that it would happen very quickly, and I do understand how the perception of speed occurs in a world where we haven't studied vaccine development, in a world where we haven't studied virology, right? When you have, and you see that typically the vaccine path is about 10 years, give or take, you recognize that a lot of the 10 years are taken up with grant writing and proposals to try and get the funding that you need to make a small study to the next stage, and then from there it's often about funding and personnel and also volunteers. And in this particular situation, none of those were a barrier. Funding, nor volunteers, nor personnel. The whole world's attention was on it. So it only makes logical sense that it was churned out in time faster. But actually, if you look at the number of studies done, the number of people in those studies, the N of the study, it actually works out that the approval of these vaccines occurred after further study than other vaccines in history have undergone before approval, because of the sheer number of people that volunteered.
Also, there was a thread in there saying like people are dying from the vaccine and not COVID. I mean, that's a fear-based statement. Do you want to speak to that one?
Yeah, it is, and in essence, it's just not a truthful one. There have been a handful of deaths that have been related to certain vaccines. The results of those have led to some of the vaccines being pulled back for further examination and further understanding. But in no way, shape, or form does that approximate or come anywhere close to the 4.5 million people worldwide that have died as a result of COVID-19. It's not comparable. You can't, again, it's a false equivalence. And to say that more people are dying from the vaccine than COVID is it's unfortunately just not truthful.
There were also some comments in that thread, basically around how healthy our body is. So, a healthy immune system supported in simple ways is a marvelous alternative to vaccines, supported by smart supplementation when one takes ill. It has worked for my family for decades and for the human species for millennia, and no doubt it will continue to do so. Like speaking directly to, we just need a really healthy immune system.
Yeah, and I've heard that sentiment echoed in conversations that I've had over the last year and a half, in all forms. I've heard that being something that's been strongly echoed. And there's many things that I'd like to talk about here. The first one I think I'll say is that this perspective, as well as being not entirely truthful as well, because people who have seemingly otherwise been quote unquote healthy have also died. And so it's diminishing of those lives lost. And also it's quite a privilege, perhaps even ableist, to suggest that all we need is a healthy immune system. Because there are huge swaths of the population for whom that, what we might collectively consider a healthy immune system, is simply not attainable, whether it's through chronic illness or various other things. It's not necessarily attainable for everybody. And so in some ways, statements like that are sentencing for those people for whom it's not possible to reach whatever that level is we determine, right, of a healthy immune system. It's sentencing them to a permissible death, right, which I think is really the opposite of ahimsa, the opposite of compassion, and the opposite of things like community care and taking care of one another. And so I think we have to recognize, if we have the perspective that a healthy immune system is all we need, you might, to some degree, embody that idea, but also recognize that's not necessarily in the control of every individual. Not everyone has the same choices available to them that you might. And when we lead with that understanding, we recognize that actions taken for the benefit of other people are incredibly valuable, in some cases, life-saving.
I want to bring in a comment that was shared. I don't know who shared it. We don't need to share that, but this comment really speaks to what feels like to me the opposite of ahimsa. And like you said, that ableism. This person says, disease works as natural selection on every other species on Earth. Why the heck are we thinking that this is or we are immune to this inevitable process is beyond me. Disease absolutely has a function. Disease only runs rampant in overpopulated and malnourished hosts. And Elliot, who is a good friend of mine, responded to this and posted about it and said, yes, you have my full permission to share, saying like COVID has made it okay to verbalize that chronically ill and or disabled people's lives don't matter and aren't worth the slightest inconvenience, like masks, to save much less the vaccine. For all you able-bodied people out there, disabled people are exhausted and pissed. And we've been since the pandemic has started, and really before, and the whole country started screaming loudly how worthless our lives are considered. And I just want to acknowledge the weight of that. Thank Elliot for this. Thank you for speaking out as well about it. And this makes me really upset when we start to look at, well, I'm healthy, or, I don't need the vaccine because I'm healthy. And this doesn't feel like ahimsa to me in the yoga world. This doesn't feel like it's making spaces accessible. And a lot of people like Elliot have been hiding away, locked away at home, waiting for people to get vaccinated, waiting for the world to be a safer place for them.
Yeah. And I also think that on top of that, it's like, how do I say it? Like, in a lot of ways, before the pandemic, there were existing struggles that we didn't necessarily have to face up if you were able-bodied. And now there's more availability of information and experience around that process. And so to voice something like, oh, it's just natural selection, is going in the direction of perhaps, with even a harmful intent. It comes across very directly ableist and also individualist, something that I think as a yoga community we often talk about is the interpretation of this idea of yoga. And one of the numerous interpretations or translations of the concept of yoga is unity. To a lot of the discussion related to the pandemic and health, we often resort back to individual views of health rather than is our health, how our health impacts other people. Oh, I think I'm Shannon. That's my.
It's my internet, I think. I'm just excited to see you still here. Oh, I'm so glad
Okay,
it's
I
still
think we're
here.
back.
I think it was my internet.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, I lost you for a second, and I was like, "Oh, I wonder if it
Yeah,
was me or if it
my
was
whole
if
thing
it
just
was
went.
you."
I was like,
Um,
"Oh gosh." Sorry, go ahead and finish that statement.
that's all good. Yeah, yeah. I was just saying, how in some ways the yoga community is very heavily focused on unity and bringing people together and connection, and that we are all one, and simultaneously fighting for individual health and not fighting for community health, not fighting for the health of our neighbors, not fighting for the health of those whom we are connected with. And that that idea is incongruent. It doesn't mesh well. Um, and and it's also often a reflexive fear-based process of regressing back into how do I take care of myself, right? It's a survival instinct and a fear-based response. And we should take some time to think about that, think about also how our actions and decisions influence other people in all aspects of our lives. We are in no way isolated from the existence of the people who surround us. No, in no way, shape, or form. And so another thing that often comes up in this conversation is that, me being healthy doesn't place you in any risk at all. Um, and and actually it can in an ideal setting, no, it wouldn't, but this is not an ideal setting. um, the virus that is highly contagious and also contagious before symptoms appear, you don't necessarily know if you are harmful to people before it's too late. um, and simply being healthy doesn't guarantee any particular level of protection necessarily against the virus, because again, there have been plenty of healthy people that have lost the battle.
I wonder if anyone here watching live has any questions, because I feel like I find a ton of comfort in saying, well, what about this part of it? Or also, I'm wondering if you feel like it's okay. I don't want to push everyone, but if you can share, like, what's one thing that is bringing up some fear right now? Drew, you've talked about this before and you've talked about it throughout. Like, we are all experiencing levels of fear around different topics right now, living in this pandemic and just honestly living on Earth. Um, and and I feel like we can share those questions and share our fears, and also the conversation around, like, how is this going to impact me as a yoga teacher, as a business owner, as a parent? Like, there's so many things that we're all dealing with as well. Um, and so feel free to put it in the comments. I want to come back to what you said about we don't pose risk to other people, Drew. I think this is important to really get into this. I think there's a ton of confusion right now. I've heard people say, well, you got the vaccine, so why are you worried? And personally, I could not, like, I'm around vulnerable people, immunocompromised people, children. I If I'm around unvaccinated people, I make sure that I'm wearing my mask. It's very acceptable here in Ontario. There's been a mask mandate the whole time. I'm curious to hear, like, what are we hearing from the science side of things about being quote unquote healthy, whether we're vaccinated or not, and the risk that poses.
Yeah, for sure. I think perhaps there's been more weight, anecdotally speaking, given to the idea of being healthy without really understanding what elements of health we're talking about. Whether it's certain food groups, whether it's um, certain environments that we live in, whether it's our levels of stress, whether it's you know, um, certain supplements that we're taking, or the level of sun that we're getting, right? There have been a few of those little pieces that seem to be key. One of those is vitamin D levels, right? And so sun has been shown to have some kind of a link with the severity of disease. But again, it's not a 100% type of a thing. So then, as it relates to getting a vaccine, if you get the vaccine or get a vaccine, you are preparing yourself as best as we can for being able to fend off the virus. And because almost no vaccine is 100%, almost no vaccine gives sterilizing immunity after the first 2 shots, we still have a risk, a small risk, but a risk nonetheless of becoming infected, even if we are vaccinated fully. And then there's a subgroup of those folks who, some of them will not be contagious because the infection is so minor that there's essentially no viral load that's shareable. And then there's going to be a group of those who will be able to share the virus. And so whilst the viral load is probably going to be less if you are fully vaccinated, it's still beneficial and helpful for everybody if you continue to wear a mask, because the virus is so easily spread through the air. It's the vaccines provide a generous amount of security and protection, and it's not 100%. In a similar way to the idea of being healthy might provide a percentage of resistance to an infection of any virus. And like I said before, you can be contagious without knowing that you even have the virus. Because you oftentimes, with a lot of respiratory diseases, you become contagious before you present with symptoms. And so you might notice symptoms and then immediately start to take precautionary measures, and that could still be too late for some of the people that you come into contact with. And so good habits and consideration suggest that whenever you can, whenever you are around people who are unvaccinated, who have higher risk of sharing the virus with others, and when you're around at-risk folks, mask up and do your best to take care of them, because we're all supposedly in this together, and so it's important, I think, to take small actions. They're small actions, really, for the care of others.
One of our live listeners says, I'm worried about in-person classes at our studio, even though we have mandatory vaccine policy. I know vaccinated people are less likely to transmit the virus, but to what extent is a fully vaccinated yoga class safe? This is a great question.
It is, absolutely. And I think it will, the percentages that you see around efficacy for the reduction of transmission, K is quite different to data that's coming out of the US, for example. And in the US, we see a much higher percentage of protection offered from the vaccines in relation to how contagious you are if you've been doubly vaccinated and you manage to get a breakthrough infection, versus in the UK, it's looking like it's a little bit of a lower perspective. And this is probably going to differ around the world. You'd have to sort of seek your own national data sets in order to do some number crunching. But I think, in an enclosed space, if we're looking at a yoga class, we can still mask up. We can still make sure that ventilation is of the utmost importance. And we can still check for symptoms. I think that symptoms of sickness in general are great signs to just stay at home that day, or stay at home for the next few days while you recover, right? And I know that a lot of people are going to be really excited about going back to in-person classes, and perhaps they might ignore some of those, cold and flu-like symptoms, and because of their excitement. And I think, it's deeply important to recognize that. You can also add extra layers of protection with things like temperature testing at the entrance of the building. That's always an additional great step for someone who, again, may not necessarily feel horrible, but they might already be developing symptoms that show some type of infection is present.
This is what I mean about like the tough choices that we're all faced with for our own personal, for our family, for our loved ones that we're around, our yoga students, our communities. Like, I really want to say, like, my heart goes out to many of you. This person is saying, I'm not comfortable being indoors and not wearing a mask, even if I know everyone's vaccinated. Outdoors, I'm okay if proof of vaccine is required. So this means I wouldn't go to studio classes, although none here require proof of vaccine anyway. So the other side of this is to really consider, how are our students feeling as well? And for me, clear policies, clear, like, here's how things are set up at our studio really helps me to assess, is this a place that I want to hang out? I want to know. Another question that came up, sorry, I'm jumping around here a bit, Drew, is someone was saying, like, everyone who's attending the class needs to have proof of vaccination. What about the teacher? Because where they are, the teacher doesn't have to. And they got back to that, like, truth that Satya, talking to people about whether we're vaccinated or not if they're coming to our yoga class.
Yeah, I think disclosure is important. And I've heard the argument that, you know, our health information is private. And I can also respect that. If you want to keep your health information private, then unfortunately, that's a decision that will also have consequences attached to it that you may not like. Um, I don't see, and I think the main fear around the sharing of that information, and I've seen it in a number of different exchanges online, is the fear that the sharing of the status of the vaccination status for this one particular virus is somehow a stepping stone or a slope that we slip down automatically towards the sharing of literally all of our health information and health history. And I think that comes back to the fear that then drives exaggeration around something that's not real. You having a vaccination card in no way, shape, or form shares any of your additional health history at all with anybody. Um, and I also think it's important to note at that point that your own right to privacy is not more important than another person's right to safety, another person's right to avoiding infection from a potentially deadly virus.
Jenny's just saying, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion, such a thoughtful, respectful conversation. Also saying, like, my biggest fear is not being able to visit my elderly parents who live far away. We're all vaccinated, but I'm very afraid of the breakthroughs. Anything that you want to say to that?
Yeah, I think, just to validate that fear, I think that is a representation of the care that you are embodying. Um, and I think there are certain things we can do in the lead up to a visit on both sides, right? Both parties setting up a visit where you can participate in a small quarantine for yourself, for maybe a week or so in the lead up to it. Reduce the times that you're heading out into, especially uncontrolled environments where you don't know who's vaccinated and who's not. You can order your groceries online in a lot of places, and it's not necessarily accessible for everybody, and I definitely understand that. But if you live in a metropolitan space where those types of services are available, they can really be a benefit. And so you can create your own little sort of mini quarantine in advance of becoming in contact with people who are perhaps at greater risk, of serious consequences.
That's super helpful. Here's a comment that I have seen as well. Sunny B Yoga says that they're hearing, like, well, in Israel, all of the hospitalized people have been vaccinated. Like, that's something that I've seen spread around online, and it's frustrating when we run into these comments when they're not, like, what do we do when we bump into these comments? We're like, that isn't
Yeah.
the actual truth.
Yeah, I think if you feel so inclined to step into that battle, then share resources whenever you can with those types of statements, and with the folks that share those types of statements, and build greater context, because I do think that many more people that comment many more people than actually leave a comment on a status or a post actually view everything and get reading. And so for those people who come to the post, perhaps don't leave their own remarks, but do go ahead and read, you may not change the person's mind who posts it, you may not contribute to their own exploration of the topic, but you may contribute to the development of context for other people who are coming there and looking for like, oh, is that, oh, okay, that sounds wild, is that real? And then in a comment underneath the post, it says, actually, to clarify, this is actually what's happening. These are the numbers, this is the resource, this is why the scientists estimate that this is why this is happening, and so X, right? I do think
Yeah,
if you can help develop context there, it's always a helpful thing.
that is helpful. And Sunny B says, I just quit teaching in the yoga studio because the owner and most of the teachers are opposed to vaccinations and masks. And most of my students are older and vulnerable. I just couldn't continue there. And I just want to say, like, my heart goes out to you because I know what it's like to need to, say this isn't matching my values. This isn't working for me. And those are tough choices to make.
Yeah, definitely.
Also, here's another question from Aruna saying also the impact of vaccinations on children. In Canada, children over 12 can get vaccinated, younger children cannot. We're doing online kids yoga classes. Any thoughts on children being affected?
Yeah, for sure. This one, I actually just had a conversation with someone about this morning and yesterday, and this one is very regionally dependent because if we look at, for example, UK data suggests that kids under 12, if and when they get it, are very minimally impacted. And there are very few health consequences. They're very resistant to health consequences surrounding the virus. And that's not the same for every country. The US is an entirely different story, as is, off the top of my head, as is the statistics coming out of the Philippines and Southeast Asian countries. Young children are not having necessarily positive outcomes from infection from the virus. And so I think it's important to again seek your national data sets when investigating this to determine risk and to determine what might be the best choices for you and your family. Because in some instances, the evidence shows that there's not much of an effect, and in other instances, yes, there has been some really profound and horrible effects for youth.
Yeah. Yoga with Natalie is saying, I've completely stopped teaching kids. I don't want to be responsible for anyone getting sick or vice versa. And these are the tough decisions, if we choose to teach online or cancel those classes for now. I so appreciate that you said this is really, we have to check in with our own area. I didn't even think of the children's yoga. So thank you so much, everyone who shared that as well. Is there anything else, Drew? I really appreciate we've been on here so long and I can talk to you for so long. Is there anything in summary? Is there anything that we've missed? Also, if people have comments, feel free to share those as well.
Yeah, there was one thing that I think I missed, and it was the note about, we've been relying on our immune systems and appropriate supplementation for millennia, and it's worked just fine. That piece I didn't address, and I think it's important to note that anthropologically speaking, that's not necessarily correct. Historically, a few hundred years ago, we were dying from highly preventable, well, at this stage, they're highly preventable diseases and conditions that we're no longer dying from because we didn't have medical support, the same medical supports available to us. And we were solely and entirely reliant upon whatever immunity that we had within our own systems. And we can see that reflected very easily in life expectancy. Our life expectancy has historically, up until I think it was last year, has historically year per year gone up and up and up and up as an average. I think last year it went down for the first time in recorded history. And so if we're looking at the things that have occurred over the millennia, we've been highly susceptible and highly impacted by viruses, bacteria, parasites, and things that we would have historically died from, and now we have treatments and medication for that prevent us from dying. And so I think that's really important to note as well, that this is not, the idea of medical intervention is not a new idea, nor is it having minimal impact. It's having substantial impact.
Thank you for that. I also wanted to just really highlight I'm hearing and I'm feeling that there's a lot of division right now. And I don't know what the answer is to, like, how can we have less division around these topics? I'm here for any ideas because
Yeah.
it's tough when it's in our communities, in our family, when it's online. I also want to address that it's really tough. Like, I have followed and learned from Gil, had Gil on the podcast, and I appreciate that you called out his huge expertise in this. And then it's difficult when you see someone that you've really learned from, and you get into a conversation where it feels like, why are you not? Why can't we see each other's side in this?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pieces, and this ties it back in with the original post as well, but something that we can all work towards, I think, is trying to encapsulate as much nuance as possible and establish as much context as possible. Whatever your position is, again, I don't think at any point throughout this call we've recommended one way or another. I think that what's really critically important is that you talk to health professionals, the ones who have expertise in these areas, and also establish context for yourself and your families, and also embrace nuance. And so when talking about this idea of division, I think we can overcome that. I think we can bridge that space by doing our best to embody nuance in the topic. And I'll also say that when we have a perspective that's perhaps not the same as the majority, and I'll go ahead and say, for those who do not want to get the vaccine, keep in mind that when you communicate those views to other people, that them disagreeing with you is not necessarily the only side of division, right? Keep in mind that division takes two parties. And so both in the context of, the ways in which we respond to those posts, but also the ways in which those posts are constructed and the ideas are shared, when more nuance is embodied, the outcome is always better and feels less divisive, I would posit.
That's so good. Thank you so much for your time today. Tell us, how can we learn more from you? I feel like we can come and hang out and learn about bees in Costa Rica if we want to. Tell us, how can we connect with
Absolutely.
you further?
Absolutely. Yes. Oh my gosh, I'm obsessed with bees. For anyone who I haven't met yet, I'm absolutely obsessed with not just honeybees, but native bee species here in Costa Rica as well. It's become it's become quite the obsession over the pandemic, and it started before that. Um, so I would love to share bee stories with you, share bee information with you. I'm down here in Costa Rica. We have a little retreat center. If anyone does want to come, either run a retreat or come to a retreat when things are looking a little bit more available, that would be incredible and wonderful. Otherwise, we can connect online. On Instagram is where I'm most present, but Facebook as well. And yeah, if anyone wants to connect about any of these things that we talked about today, then please hit me up.
That's amazing. One day I'm going to come and see your bee. I just have a tiny bee home here. It's like called the solitary bee home, and I'm already
Yes.
fascinated by that.
Yes.
um,
Oh,
so here's to
amazing.
finding things that we can connect on for sure. Uh, Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Connected Yoga Teachers, we are here for you if you have questions. Some teachers have been sending me some other questions around policies that are coming in. And also, we're going to have a guest on soon that's been making it her mission to talk to people specifically in like vaccine hesitancy and just really being like, this is my yoga right now, is to connect people with experts. So Wolf will be joining us. Thank you all for being here. So Amanda is saying thank you both for this incredible conversation, sending you both a big virtual hug. Jennifer, thanks for being here. Jamie, this was wonderful, just absolutely wonderful. Thank you for this timely and critical conversation. Thank you for this discussion. Thank you for your expertise, says Jessica. Great discussion. Thanks for the time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. Take care. Thank you, Denite, for being here. Thank you, everyone.
Shannon. Thanks for doing this,
Thanks,
Shannon.
Drew.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.